It's fantastic to be here with you today, Bruce. You are a top workplace culture expert, not just enthusiast. You are now a two-time best-selling Sunday Times author with your new book, which I have right here, Fortitude. Congratulations. This is very well thumbed, including the, if I count it correctly, 55 pages of references and notes, which shows the depth and research of the book. I mean, it's fantastic. It is a brilliant read. It is, as I say, packed full of academic research, stories that we can relate to, told in a very eloquent, brilliant way. And I congratulate you, and I think it's an absolutely fantastic book.
Thank you so much.
You've had a very long and successful, even though you're very young, long and successful career in media and tech, including your former role at Twitter, and you host an even more popular and successful podcast than this, which everyone will know about. So welcome to the show, Bruce. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Look, I'm really grateful for that introduction.
Pleasure.
When you spend a couple of years putting a book together, it's this really strange thing where you really have very limited feedback on it, and so you don't know how it's going. So when people say nice things, it feels like sort of delayed gratification to a large extent.
And you've had lots of plaudits from quite a wide range of people as well, not just the usual sort of business community. You've had sports people, journalists and others, and I'll share all the links and so on to listeners so they can see all of that. So we are going to talk about fortitude. We may touch on the word resilience if we're allowed to, workplace culture, and as always in this podcast, a little about you. Now, in a nutshell, you clearly challenge conventional wisdom that resilience is all about the individual. Just suck it up, get on with it, do the inner work. And you bring in this sort of collective view of fortitude. And I quote you, and you say, fortitude means the strength that we draw from feeling in close synchrony with those around us, from feeling part of something meaningful that is bigger than us. And you say that in our innate sociability lie many of the remedies for the problems that we experience as individuals. I think that's brilliant. I mean, that's the central premise. But I think you actually say you need a bit of both. You're not saying that individual resilience is irrelevant. Can we start there?
Yeah, look, exactly right. I mean, the critical thing is that I found that when you talk about resilience, and resilience is this term that follows us around, everyone expects everyone else they meet to be more resilient. They expect their kids to be resilient, the people they meet at work to be resilient, whoever it is. People expect more resilience. And the strange thing about it is that I would chat to people and I'd say to them, they'd say to me, I've been on a resilience course. I said, oh, how was it? And people would say, without hesitation, they'd say, it didn't work. And the worst thing about resilience is that it feels like this nebulous, sort of hard to touch concept. The idea that we need to be more resilient, we all recognize that there's probably a time that we need to have this hardiness, this fortitude, but it's very difficult for us to know what the actions are that we're meant to take. And so, like you say, there are a couple of, these three strands to the way that I frame the term, and two of them are specifically individual, and one of them I think is this more commanding and more important notion that resilience is the strength we draw from each other. So yeah, absolutely, I've sort of got this the wonderful thing about it is that actually you can have countless debates with people about resilience, and a lot of people have got their own perspective. I know what resilience is. And actually, when you start going through specific examples of when you've seen resilience manifested and demonstrated, it's very hard not to find examples in what people are saying about a strength that we draw from each other, a sort of collectivist response. So yes, I guess that was my fixation, really, spending 2.5 years thinking about these things. That's where I ended up.
Yes. And you talk about the stories we tell ourselves and the immediate story, and then the story when you dig into it, which is often quite different in terms of where you draw the strength from. But you take on, and you're brave yourself, you take on some pretty big hitters in terms of challenge, in looking at their research, the practice of it, whether it's the Carol Dweck on growth mindset, on grit, Andrew Duckworth, Seligman on positive psychology. In a nutshell, what are they? I know they're all different strands of a broadly similar field. What do they get wrong?
So what you find is, I think, to frame that argument there. So that's it. The book starts with a lot of stories, a lot of examples, a lot of relatable episodes, and there is this sort of bridge that we go over at one stage, which is this chapter that attempts to sort of explain the issues with the way we see resilience. And broadly, there's an interesting thing where most of the leading psychology in the world emanates from US universities, largely based on funding, largely based on scale, fame, and reputation. And as a consequence of that, one of the things that we often don't observe, but there's a degree of politicization with the agendas that certain psychologists have got. And look, the preeminent psychologist whose work runs through the whole of the resilience literature that you see, if you work in an organization and your company has done resilience training, if you work in the armed forces and you've experienced resilience training, if you work in a school and you've implemented resilience training, almost without exception, it will be based on the work of Martin Seligman, one of the most revered psychologists in the world. But he's got a very individualistic take when it comes to resilience. So, he styles himself as being the best person to make these judgments because he says he himself is a depressive. So anytime that he feels there's an intervention he wants to stage, his first experimental implementation is on himself. And there's a really interesting point about that. He is a rich, widely acclaimed psychologist who lives in Philadelphia. And, you might say that even if he considers that, he's got this depressive aspect to his life, his lived experience is possibly very different from people who might be in food poverty or might have experienced adverse childhood trauma. So, I think it's sort of a cautionary note. Beware comparing your own lived experience to other people. But what you end up finding is that his research is very focused on individualistic interventions. And look, what we find is that generally, when people exhibit signs of feeling feeble and weak and maybe sort of like they need some support, it's generally, and I'll give sort of plenty of evidence, it's generally when we feel disconnected, estranged and alienated from the people we're surrounded with. Really interesting examples. I could give you extreme examples, but probably the world's leading expert on teenage mental health is a woman called Jean Twenge, and really interesting researcher. In fact, I encountered her work because she wrote an article that really broke out in the Atlantic magazine, American magazine. And it was called How Smartphones Destroyed a Generation. So, pretty spiky, no punches pulled. But the really interesting thing that she discovered during the pandemic, that we might imagine the pandemic was in aggregate across the whole length of it, a mental health disaster. But what she found is in the first couple of months of the pandemic, when we were establishing new routines, we were sort of finding ourselves maybe for the first time sharing an evening meal with the people we shared a house with, just simply because, we'd never been home at 6 o'clock together or, 6:30 together before. And now all of a sudden we were gathering around the dining table and discussing the mundanities or the confusion of our day. And what Jean Twenge discovered was that teenagers who started having a family meal every night together, their depression went down and their resilience went up. Wow. Look, she actually says that what's happened to teenagers over the course of the last 15 years is that they've gone from the most defining example of Generation We, where they had this sort of collectivism, and they've transitioned into Generation Me, where, albeit that they've got little threads of connection to each other electronically, they don't spend as much time hanging together. They don't spend as much time in each other's bedrooms, meaning teenage pregnancy has gone down massively. They don't spend they don't spend time immersed in each other in the same way. And the pandemic re-immersed them, albeit in the unit of their family. So that's really interesting. There, the only example you could say, it was like a weird experiment, but the only thing you could say is that, okay, that immersion in a family group, in a family we, seemed to be protective of them. And look, I could spend 10 minutes trying to persuade you by giving you countless other examples. The people of Ukraine evidently are incredibly resilient in the moment right now. But, if you see testimony and people talking to them, they describe it in really mundane terms. Like, oh, we had to do this. We feel we want to do this. We feel confident about what we're doing. That fortitude that comes is really because they feel part of something and connected to something, I think.
Yes. And it's interesting, these terms, whether it's grit or growth mindset or other aspects of positive psychology, they often get simplified down to you must do this one thing. And those terms are used widely, particularly growth mindset in corporates, which gets assumed down to it's all about you. And actually what your book draws out and your research draws out is it's more nuanced than that. There are downsides from it. And actually there is a power in as you say, in that collective, whether you consciously realize it or not. So say you are an individual in a company, and this is a business podcast, but company or in your family who is suffering in some shape or form. And you have the self-awareness to realize that you can't do it all yourself. You've tried, you're exhausted, burnt out, traumatized, whatever it is, either from the now or the past. What are the sorts of things that have you seen that worked in terms of actually drawing on that collective power?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. Firstly, one of the things I would advise anyone overall, if you are feeling maybe at a low ebb and you're wondering how the situation you're in is impacting you, probably the biggest single predictor of individual well-being is a degree of personal control. Personal autonomy. So the way that you might be finding that your situation is denying that, evidently, the absence of financial control would be a really deeply held one right now. Certainly, people, I've chatted to two people this week who said, my mortgage is up for renewal and I'm really terrified what's going to happen. I presume this was going to be straightforward. All of a sudden I've got to find another few £100 a month. So the absence of control is a really critical one. And so, one of the things that you might say, I witnessed this in one of my former jobs, that, people were incredibly burnt out. And, you'd ask them, okay, describe to me your day. And they would describe 6 or 7 hours of back-to-back meetings where they sort of question when they were meant to get the job done, because their bosses were expecting magnificent endeavors, great achievement, and they were just thinking, I've got no time to even talk to the people I'm meant to be talking to because I'm locked back to back in internal meetings. And so, one of the interventions we staged there was saying, I wonder if we can halve the amount of time people spend in internal meetings. And, it became a really interesting one because we saw an almost immediate impact in people's sense of well-being. So look, first thing I would say is that normally finding some way to get some leverage, some autonomy, some control over your situation is almost certainly the biggest way to try to get yourself on an even keel individually. Okay. The separate part is that the sense of connection to other people is really critical. Someone said to me, I did a session last week, a sort of a talk somewhere, and someone asked a spiky question. They said, so you're telling me that even though my company is a really horrible, toxic environment, all I need to do is find some friends? And I said, okay, right. Reductively, I can definitely see that, that might be the way you caricature it. So, firstly, I don't want to make apologies for toxic organizations and toxic, that's broadly where the control element comes in. If you feel like you are rendered helpless by the environment you're in, then no degree of interventions around the edges are going to make a huge difference to that. But the friend part, while it feels definitely in that sarcastic styling, it feels trivial. The impact of it seems to be transformational. There's really lovely examples. In fact, I include a couple of charts that people licensed to me in the book, which show the impact when someone has like a major heart operation or a major depressive episode. And actually, the biggest predictor of their well-being in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, 3 years is how many groups they report feeling part of. Sometimes one of these groups, they include family. But, it might be you're part of a cycling club. You're part of, a book reading club. Sort of two examples plucked from the air. But it seems like while these things might feel like a distraction, something that we do, being part of a group and feeling that we can draw upon that group and they're a meaningful reflection of who we are seems to be massively significant. And the really interesting thing, sort of to lay these things side by side, is while I hopefully, at the very least, to say that the research about individualistic resilience, let's be charitable. So let's say growth mindset, for example. I think that you can say that even though a lot of these stuff about growth mindset is really questionable, but you'd sort of scratch your head and say, does it actually prove what it's claiming? There is some reframing of growth mindset, where you say, actually, there does appear to be on the fringes, especially with kids who are struggling, there does seem to be some upside of growth mindset. However, it's pretty small. In contrast, the research about the impact of being in a group and the impact of the power of social connection is emphatic, heavily replicated. That one of the challenges of psychology is that often new psychologists can't seem to replicate the results of other psychologists.
Yes.
In group research, there's very good replication of it. And so, these lovely examples along the way. There was a writer called Robert Putnam, who's sort of like a sociologist, who wrote a big book in America about 20 years ago called Bowling Alone. And it was sort of like the phenomenon exploring of how people used to be part of clubs and social organizations in the recent past, not in sort of like a romanticized past. They used to be part of these things. Now they're not. They live a more individualized life. And he said that, the best thing that he would say, the best intervention he would say is that, even if someone is a smoker, a fairly heavy smoker, the best thing that they could do for their health is, before they even think about giving up smoking, is join a group. Because the evidence is so emphatic that being connected to other people and being part of a group has this sort of magical mystery protective part.
Yeah, I agree.
There was a lovely article in The Guardian this week, actually, or last week, about men's sheds.
Yes.
And the men's sheds is this Australian phenomenon where often men of a certain age don't really have any friends anymore. I think over the age of 45, men on average have one friend aside from their partner that they feel that they can talk to about intimate things. And so the men's sheds is an attempt to say to men, in their 50s, 60s, 70s, oh, come along here on Thursday morning or on Saturday morning, work on a craft project. And it's a space where other people are going to be doing that. And what you find is that, superficially, it's about turning up and working on a craft project. But obliquely, the goal that's accomplished is people feel part of something. A sense of community comes to those who wouldn't necessarily choose to participate in it.
And you're more likely to probably have the conversations about how you're feeling when you're doing something else rather than staring at somebody directly. It's interesting. I completely buy into the point about groups. I mean, I think depending on the issue you're facing or feeling, you have to be quite careful and selective about who you reach out to. I mean, I found that myself as a father of a severely disabled child. Some of the people I might expect to get support from, family or friends, are uncomfortable with the topic for whatever reason. Whereas there are groups of people, often surprising groups, where I can find a connection, where they maybe have a similar lived experience, they have more empathy or whatever it is, but you have to search for it quite carefully. It's not as though you have to do some work often. You can't just expect people to come and give you support.
Yeah, and I think it's the critical thing you mentioned there is that degree of synchrony. You see, when you can achieve that synchrony, when you can feel understood, and that you've got the privilege of understanding someone else, it can sort of transform the relationship. The challenge, of course, is when we feel unsynchronized with people. So you see examples of this: people who've gone through awful experiences, but they have no one to relate it to. The one example I think comes to mind on that is just juxtaposing the individualistic experience of victims of 9/11 and the collectivist experience. There was a very famous photo from 9/11. She was styled the Dust Lady. It was this woman standing in, I think the reception of one of the Twin Towers just after the first one had collapsed, and she was standing sort of with her arms frozen almost, and she was covered in dust, and it looked like a statue. It was a woman called Marcy Borders, and the interesting thing about her experience is that because her Twin Tower knocked down, she lost her job immediately afterwards, and so her experience of the aftermath of the Twin Towers was one of isolation. She used to sit at home. She'd gone through this trauma. She'd seen bodies fall out of the window in the tower above her. She'd then seen the tower collapse. She'd gone through this trauma, and because she was on her own, she described a descent into drink, later into drugs. She lost both of her children; they were taken away from her, and ultimately she passed away. Actually, possibly through injuries, what she inhaled during the Twin Towers, and she had no health insurance. And you compare that to people who went through similar situations, who were firefighters and police officers, and most of them in surveys in the immediate aftermath, and then the year afterwards, and then a couple of years afterwards. Most of them were reported to have fully recovered. Now, it's really strange because broadly their experience was the same, other than
Yes.
the inhalation. But their psychological experience was the same. They'd witnessed something horrific. But the firefighters, the police officers, often if you chat to these people, they describe, a life filled with humor, like as a coping mechanism, joking about things. But, there will be a constant sense that anyone who's feeling something potent about what they experienced that day will have someone to talk to about it who can relate to it. Her experience was she had no one to relate
She was
to,
on her own.
and what you find is trauma generally, and the experience you described there of sort of having a burden of responsibility, it can serve to desynchronize us from other people. And
Yeah.
if we understand that synchrony and feeling understood is one of the things that helps unburden us from some of the things that we carry, then it seems to be sort of incredibly protective, I think.
I mean, the impact of your research and your counter to some of the existing research and practices is societally can, and I hope will have a very big impact on people's lives. And even myself, I've having read the book a few times now, reread parts of it, thought perhaps I need to change, which I think is the mark of a very good book. If you were a CEO of an organization that had been going through some form of challenge, from at one end trauma, a shock, to wide-scale burnout, to the fact that they need to be more resilient in the more volatile world that we're operating, whatever level of challenge, and they'd grown up with the mindset of, hey, come on, here's the program, here's the course, do it, suck it up, get on with it. What one or two things should that a more open-minded CEO think about doing differently?
I think these things are incredibly relevant for the moment we're in right now, because the moment we're in right now, a lot of middle managers, senior leaders, all of us are thinking work doesn't quite feel the same. And, we feel conflicted because no matter who we are, the increase in our autonomy, the fact that we can work in a more flexible way, the fact that maybe our domestic responsibilities aren't weighing on us as heavily because we're in the house at 6 o'clock rather than in the house at 7:30, or we're not leaving the house at 7:15. So it's having a big impact on our life. And we don't necessarily, a lot of people from the data, a lot of people don't necessarily want to readily concede that. But we might be thinking work doesn't feel the same. Look, one of the examples we've got of that is that the quit rate, the resignation rate, about 12 months ago, surged for a lot of companies into the 20s, 20%, and it's not gone back down. And, it was this strange thing that we thought there was almost like a post-COVID bump coming through the system,
Yes.
that more people were resigning, and it's just carried on. And it's a suggestion, I think, that our relationship with work is changing from something close to the relationship we had with school, tight, cohesive. Actually, when we did the work was governed by timetables, to the extent that if you weren't at your desk at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, people would have questions, very much like school, infantilizing capable adults. And we've moved to something closer to our relationship with college, where, maybe to some extent the friendships that we had at college, you often had friends that you hung around with. You didn't know what course they were doing. And the people on your course generally didn't necessarily, they weren't necessarily your best friends out of work.
Yes.
And now out of college. And when you did the work was less important, or where you did the work was less important than the fact you got the work done. You were appraised on, did you get the work done? So we're moving from one to the other. But one of the consequences of that is that tight, cohesive culture that we had in school and in work is dissipating a little. So if you're running an organization now, that one of the challenges is, how do I tap into that incremental, that discretionary effort that people used to give because they bought into what we were doing here. They subscribed into, wanting to make a success of this, largely because when you're surrounded with people, you're immersed in their company, you do pull together. And I think that's one of the things that this talk about resilience and talk about modern working has got in common, that, they share this sense that good cultures and resilient cultures have a really strong sense that we're all in it together.
Yes.
And so, the challenge for organizations right now is, how do we create a sense that we're all in it together, that when maybe we are only in it together 2 days a week or 3 days a week.
Yes.
And I think, that's the question that I think bosses are faced with, really.
And it's quite a shift for more mercenary organisations for them to provide that all in it together support practically, which could be anything from mentoring, giving some coaching, being there for a conversation that doesn't directly deliver a result. We can talk about it, but the reality is in most organisations, especially incumbent traditional organisations, it's do that once you've done your day job and you delivered all your results. But actually your book is saying that actually that togetherness is a core aspect of actually us delivering our best. It's not on the side or icing on the cake. It's actually a core element of organisational culture.
Yeah. And I think you're going to start seeing a real differentiation between the firms that have put the effort into this and those who haven't. I met a friend of mine for lunch last week, just after a talk had given, and he was telling me the sort of the reality of his job. He said, increasingly with younger workers, and I know that like these an attempt to always by every generation to sort of critique younger generation and say they're not made of the same stuff. But he said with younger workers in his team, every time he was raising issues of, feedback, this wasn't right, they were going to HR, and they were complaining about him going to HR. Now, what that suggests to me that in an era where we're not building up that fabric of day-to-day trust, of people chatting to each other over the desk, people recognizing that someone is supportive of you, they've sort of become this disembodied manager that you maybe see in a video call, that we need to do some of the work, probably face-to-face work, of building trust. There's probably as inconvenient as it is, there's probably a 2 or 3 hour session where everyone in the group is together. We talk about the power of feedback. We exchange stories about good feedback. We get commitment that everyone in this group buys into the idea that they believe that feedback is the thing that's going to make them better, and they exchange it with each other. Right, context now set. Next time you give feedback, people are right. I get the reason why we're doing feedback, but you kind of can't shortcut that.
You have to put the foundations in. You have to build
exactly.
You have to build the connections, because then when you want to have the more difficult or delicate or sensitive conversation, you can't leap to that if you don't know the person. You don't trust that person. But that requires, I think, a longer view of the longer game of relationships and building organizations that are genuinely higher performing and have more fortitude. I'm always curious when people write books. I haven't written one yet. That's a different topic. How it changes them. Not in terms of just, I was influenced, I was inspired by that story. And you have some brilliant stories challenging stories, from elite sport, from childhood trauma and so forth, which are, it brought tears to the eye when I read them, knowing some of them. How has it changed you in terms of what you do and how you think, Bruce, personally?
A couple of fundamental things. I think one of the things that became vivid to me was the importance of servicing, sustaining friendships and groups. So, it's not the notebook I've got here because I've just finished it, but in the notebook I had while I was writing the book, I wrote down all of the relationships that were important to me, just scribbled them in the back of the book, not in a sort of an act of anything other than thinking, I wonder if there are people who are falling through the cracks that I haven't contacted. Like COVID was a strange period for this anyway. And it was like, and it's one of those things, it's like inviting people to something. There's a constant anxiety. Who have I missed? Like that sense that, oh my gosh, and so occasionally a week later you could be like, oh my gosh, albeit that person's moved to another country, actually they are in that list. And what it did is it made me think, okay, I want to make sure that I'm making efforts to sustain these relationships and these connections in a really sort of emotion-filled way, do good things with these people. So, I set about arranging, I regularly run one reunion of people I used to work with about 15, 20 years ago. And I set about arranging another reunion of people I worked with more recently. Now, not for any other reason. Firstly, gathering email addresses. Okay, that right now we're picking somewhere. And actually, once you've done these things once, they actually become really easy to sustain. Yeah. But, I just thought, I know how much happiness that will create for me to do it. So I want to just invest in doing it. So so things like that have become really keen for me. Anytime I see, people around me who are feeling low or sort of in a bad place, I always think, okay, what's the social cure here? What's the way that we can, reconnect them to maybe some of the people that
And
have been
sometimes that,
disconnected from.
in my own experience of doing, and I try to do that as well, is just the act of reaching out can sometimes be enough. You don't have to give a solution or be this font of knowledge. Sometimes,
Absolutely.
if you can, wonderful. But sometimes just knowing that somebody's there, in your corner, can be very impactful. I mean, as you think about your growing body of work, your books, your podcast, speaking, and other things you do, what's the impact you want to have on other people?
I personally love it when people I've really had no connection from. I'm doing loads of stuff with NHS hospitals at the moment, and I love it because, I think, gosh, I had no connection to NHS hospitals, and so when all these people are getting in touch with me from NHS hospitals, I'm like, okay, well, that's firstly, it really feels. It's high impact. It's real work, like a lot of us find ourselves doing jobs where we think, yeah, it's a job, but does it matter? Does it have an impact on the wider society? And so when you're doing stuff with hospitals, I'm doing a talk for a big fire brigade in a couple of months. And so, those things, firstly, it makes me feel like you can't fake it when you're saying to that you got to find something that's going to connect. They'll see through something, but I love stuff like that because firstly I feel like all of the stuff that I've scrutinized, delved into, like gone through all of this research, and normally it's about connecting one thing with another thing that maybe hasn't been well connected before, but I love it when I'm sort of I often do all of that stuff.
I think that's one of your. I think that's one of your best.
Yeah.
I think that's just one that I think that's one of your biggest strengths in terms of connecting elements that are often in different silos or spaces. I mean, the world of business, academia, and so on is very vertically siloed. In some cases, the specialism helps, but you find connections that other people don't. So I applaud you for that. Sorry, I interrupted you. I think you were going to...
No, thank you so much. And look, I think that's a critical thing when it comes to resilience. So a lot of the stuff I talk about specifically on trauma is actually, if you're interested in trauma, there's a lot of really brilliant work that's done on it, but it's often very rarely connected into this business theme of resilience. And it's so interwoven, it's so connected, that for me, who I pretty much read every book there was about resilience, I read, hundreds and hundreds of scientific papers about resilience and all of the adjacent things. And it was this frustrating element. Or, I talk a lot about elite sports people because these are really captivating piece of work going into the biographies of sports people that I just found. I spent months and months and months immersed in that and all the implications of that. But I love that. And I was just astonished that the findings of that really never went beyond sort of brief biographical detail. So we'd hear, oh, isn't it incredible that such and such person thrived despite the fact that his mum and dad died, and you hear that and you go, what a lovely story. And then you delve into it, it's like, okay, it's way more complicated than that. And what I love is getting immersed in the complexity of it, really.
That's brilliant. I mean, one thing I'm curious about, I always ask my guests, is when they're doing their best, most extraordinary work, what are the habits and practices that you use in order to have your best day? What is it when you're in your zone?
I'm really fixated with the idea of the gap between message sent and message received. What I mean by this is quite often any of us are really clear on what message sent is going to be. The most evident example of it is that someone asks you to prepare a PowerPoint, a presentation. You start typing out what people need to know. And then you attend that meeting, and what you realize is, because the slides are really boring and it was communicated in a lifeless way, everyone on the call sat doing emails. So, message sent was, this is really important, we need to do it. It was delivered in such a bad way that message received was, apparently there was a presentation about such and such. And so, like, the gulf between that. And so I'm fixated with trying to understand what's the delivery mechanism for complicated points. It's like when you do a presentation 5 times, maybe on the fifth time, you say something in a slightly different way, and you see like a degree of recognition that you hadn't seen before. You're like, okay, right, okay, this is like, a process of iteration, but trying to work out the message. And I'm constantly obsessed with that. So I spend lots of time. I've been watching this week. My search was funny TED Talks because I'm just interested in, sometimes when you watch something, you're like, oh, the fact that was funny.
Yeah. How do they do it?
Me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. What's the mechanic of it? Like the Ken Robinson TED Talk that you've probably watched. A lot of his delivery for humor is call and response. He'll say something and then he'll, in a second voice, go, what do I mean by that? And then he adds a joke. It's really interesting, like trying to deconstruct. But the great thing about it is you get to the end of that Ken Robinson TED Talk, you're like, I care about the themes he's brought up. I remember the themes he's brought up. And I'm like, he's taken me on a journey where I feel it was a gift to me that he's made me care about them. It's so extraordinary. I'm fixated with that. So I spent loads of time, all the time thinking, how did someone get that point across so well? What is it? You might sort of look at it. What is it about certain LinkedIn posts that you feel moved by, or Twitter posts, or Instagram posts? And what are the ones that you just nod and pass by? I'm so.
And then the even harder bit, Bruce, is then working out how you do it in your own way.
I know.
It's interesting. I think we share that intrigue and fascination. When I moved from actually running lots of large projects to a world now where I have more one-on-one or team-based interventions, which are much smaller, I don't have, and I consciously don't have, teams of people scurrying away in between. So those moments have to be higher quality. So how can you create those moments? And that's been a journey of discovery, feedback, stress, but actually joy in saying, how do you make 1 hour matters more than 5 days? So we share that. Bruce, we could talk for hours. We've got a lot to talk about, but I'm sensitive you have lots of people who are interested in your wisdom. I mean, you are a stimulating, wonderful person. It's been a pleasure learning from you. Your book, as I say, is substantive. It's distinctive, and it will move people, and I think it will change lives, and I mean that sincerely. At a practical level, how can people find out more about you and your work?
All of my stuff really is at my website, eatsleepworkrepeat.com. And, whether that is a link to this current book or my podcast or newsletters that I do. So all of it, you'll find all of it there.
Fantastic. Bruce, thank you ever so much. That was another edition of Lancefield on the Line. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel and to the podcast. Give us a nice rating if you're feeling generous. And do check out the other episodes when you're there. And Bruce, thank you ever so much for your time again. Thank you.
Thanks again. Thank you.
Thank you.